research on implicit psi is leading, actually.
Can you distinguish clearly between schizotypy and schizophrenia or other forms of psychosis?
So this is a can of worms. So I'll do my short version. So there's different constructs of schizotypy, we'll say that, different approaches to understanding it. The British approach, and so I'm British, I came from that background, is influenced by Gordon Claridge's approach to schizotypy. And that approach suggests that you might see traits that might mimic what you see in schizophrenia, but in watered down forms, the traits can have value. Whereas the more Chapman US idea of schizotypy is that if you see traits that are watered down schizophrenia, it's watered down pathology. So you've got sort of elements of pathology in your system. I think both schools would agree that schizotypy relates to paranormal belief and paranormal experience and transpersonal experiences, but they would have different ways of understanding that, perhaps. So it does relate to schizophrenia, although schizophrenia is another complete can of worms. I suppose the idea might be that you could see different levels of expression of anything like that. In high levels of expression, you might see more likelihood of certain types of behavior. So in schizotypy, you might see tendencies to have meaning making and creativity and spirituality and paranormal ideation. But what we see actually is that those traits seem to be distinct from pathology. The pathological aspects seem to be associated with the other types of schizotypy. So there's different types of schizotypy. There's positive schizotypy, negative, impulsive, and disorganized. And so the things that look like what we see as schizophrenia is often the positive traits, like hallucinations, perceptual distortions, that you could easily say, oh, well, paranormal experiences are all pathological. But actually, what makes those pathological is how we react to them. And so a lot of my work's focused on the traits as they're playing out in the general population. And what we see is that people who have these traits, these watered down traits that look a bit like the schizophrenic traits, can be less healthy, but they can be more than healthy. So there's a healthy schizotype and there's a less healthy schizotype. So healthy schizotype will have the positive traits, but less of the others, less of the social isolation, less of the impulses, less of the disorganization. Very organized, in fact, makes sense. It's appraised positively. And so we don't often see the differences there if we just look at scores on a questionnaire, but they are different. And there's not enough research yet on those differences. But Nicola Holt and I found some evidence that the healthy schizotype was actually more efficiently filtering out the psi stimulus. So there's something there about the healthy schizotype. So it does relate, it echoes schizophrenia, but it would be very easy to say that it's echoing pathology when I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's much more complicated than that. So hopefully that answers your question in a short way.
Well, it's a fascinating and obviously very complicated topic, but I also want to touch on the question of temporal lobe volatility, which has been associated with people who have many spontaneous paranormal experiences.
And that is another one that clusters in with the variables that we've talked about so far. And so if you look at how temporal lobe lability correlates with positive schizotypy and transiminality and boundary thinness, it's pretty up there. It's pretty high. And so that is understood to be how connected the temporal lobe limbic areas are with the rest of the brain. It's associated with how we shift easily between states of consciousness. It correlates with dissociation too, like how much we kind of jump into these different states. It is part of the cluster, I think, of anomaly-prone variables. So when you start digging deeper, you start seeing this pattern emerging of related variables. So some of them are more about fluidity and jumping into different states. Others seem to be more about connecting, but they all tend to sort of relate to one another. And I suppose that's where we get to the transliminality construct as one of the better ways of understanding this, because that was developed from a factor analysis that had a lot of variables put into it. And it seems like that is something like all of them put together. It's about connectivity. It's about tendencies to jump into altered states that relate to the temporal lobes. I'm pointing out, I've just been teaching my undergrad class on that. Where are your temporal lobes? Tendencies to shift into different states, I think. And people who have more labile temporal lobes will be much more likely to be creative and shift into different states, which sounds a lot like other aspects of lability and liminality. So I think they are part of the same construct, liminal, labile individuals.
There's also the issue that we started to talk about and have been touching on throughout, state versus trait. Can you elaborate on that?
There's a lot of evidence from parapsychological research that certain states of consciousness seem to be much more aligned with subjective experiences, but also more ostensible sign in the lab. So if we move away from our, left brain, left brain focused, rational thinking into a more fluid state, we see more psi experiences, and we also see more psi success in various studies, actually, across the board. And so you can think about that as a state of consciousness that is anomaly prone, because it encourages anomalous experiences or exceptional experiences. So that's a state. People who are trait anomaly prone, I think, are probably more likely to be jumping into those states more often than other people because of the way that they're wired. But they might all be reaching the same place, if we can think about it in that sort of metaphor. So sometimes for some people, they might have never had a paranormal experience. So we talked about how if somebody's really sleep deprived, they might have a paranormal experience as a one-off. They might particularly have one if they're bereaved and they've had no sleep. Those things are really connected. That person might not have had any paranormal experience up until that point, or maybe have any after that, but it might change them. That could be understood to be a state of anomaly proneness. Other people might be more likely to dip into those states as a more trait way of being because of the way that they're wired, because their arousal systems are more fluid, because they're more used to jumping into these different states. They might enter the same place on a more regular basis, or they might move in and out of places more regularly than people who are not trait anomaly prone. But to complicate it more, I think that you've got to think about interaction effects too. So if you look at the Ganzfeld, for example, and who does better in the Ganzfeld, who is doing better in the Ganzfeld? Classic example, creatives. So there might be some recipe going on here. You've got an induction procedure that is designed to induce an altered state, and people who are more fluid anyway are responding to that particularly well and entering a really nice psi-conducive state and doing very well at the Ganzfeld. So I think you've got to think about that as well. So and I know that Etzel Cardini talks a lot about this and the differences between an induction procedure and an actual induced state. They're very different.
Let's just define the Ganzfeld, though, because some of our viewers won't know what it is.
Okay, yeah. So the Ganzfeld is from the German meaning whole field, and that comes from the induction procedure. So we talked about that just now. So an induction procedure is designed to encourage a particular state. And the Ganzfeld was originally designed to encourage a state that's similar to a lot of states in the real world where people report subjective paranormal experiences. And that often happens when people are in a hypnagogic half state between wakefulness and sleep. And so the Ganzfeld has several components to it. So first of all, you have relaxation instructions. You also are restricting the senses. So you're going to be listening to pink noise. And the pink noise is different from white noise because it's nicer. It sounds more like rushing water than static. So some studies have used the static, but it's just much more pleasant to have noise that's a bit more like water. And so you also have your visual sense restricted. So you will be wearing oftentimes half ping pong balls, and the ping pong balls are connected in various ways. People have tried different ways to do this. I was taught to put surgical tape around the edges of mine, and by Deborah Delanoy, and the person would then have their eyes open during the Ganzfeld session, and they would be bathed in red light. You'd also be in a dimmed chamber, relaxing in a reclining chair, and that set of procedures, so relaxing and then listening to this pink noise and having a homogeneous visual field, is designed to encourage the senses to turn inward. So essentially you are habituating to the sound and the visual field, and after a while your attention turns inward and you start noticing more of your internal world. So I've run myself through this several times as well, and it's really quite an interesting experience, especially as you move from a novice into knowing how your mind works in this. It's really interesting. So now my experience of being in the Ganzfeld will be that after a while I would start experiencing more imagery. And so the idea of the Ganzfeld is that it can be used to assess ESP, extrasensory perception. So oftentimes it's set up as a telepathy design. So you might have a sender in another room or another building even, and the sender would be attempting to psychically send a target to the person who's in the Ganzfeld, the receiver. And so the receiver is watching their imagery, watching their experience and verbalizing. And the idea is that the sent imagery might influence the receiver's imagery. And so it is actually pretty interesting. Sometimes it does. At the end of the sending period, you would see 4 possible targets. One's the target, one's the 4 decoys. So you don't know which is which. And the idea is that you are going to look at the 4, and if psi is happening, if psi is influencing your imagery, you're going to be more likely to select the actual target compared to the decoys. But the state of consciousness is very, very interesting, and it is in some ways similar to the hypnagogic state, but it's not exactly like that. It seems like it's probably more similar to a meditative state or hypnosis, because you are sort of relaxed and focused at the same time. You're vigilant. Your mind is sort of seeking something from outside. So it's not completely like the hypnagogic state, but it's supposed to be hypnagoid. It's like the hypnagogic state.